Hello, hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. This season, I will be narrating for you the young adult romance Blemished Beauty by Brenda Hodnett, which, by the way, you can buy the printed copy of on Amazon. Today we will be continuing with the love triangle of Daphne, Tom, and David. But then you have Laurel in there, so what is that, a love square? I don't know. But it's happening, so here we go. Chapter 21, Party Time. Before the small, or so they tried to be, group of friends had their fried steak and burgers ready, Daphne's small dorm room was jam-packed with noisy bodies. Tom was glad he was busy with the homemade fries and didn't have to mingle too much with the crowd. He never knew how to act in these situations when everyone was so wild. That heinous David DeLute was here with all the ladies fawning over him. So ridiculous. Daphne came into the kitchen frequently to check on Tom and see if he needed anything. He knew she was just trying to make sure he didn't feel taken for granted, and he was grateful for that. At the same time, he wished she were coming in to see him. "It smells delicious," Daphne said as she came to observe the simmering fries. "Thanks," Tom started to say, but David, who had followed Daphne into the kitchen, beat him to it. "Yes, everything looks and tastes incredible," David agreed. "I can't wait to try those fries. Did you hire this guy, Daphne?" Tom clenched his teeth together, but fortunately his back was to them, so neither Daphne nor David saw his response. "No, this is my friend Tom," said Daphne. "He's doing this all pro bono." Obligingly, Tom turned around enough so he could see them. Luckily, he had to man the frying pan, so he didn't have to shake hands with the slimy bike thief. "Hi, I'm Tom Moulton," he said a bit stiffly. "I believe we already know each other." David looked surprised, and his cheeks turned a bit ruddy, probably from all the scandal about him. David cleared his throat and tried to act unaffected. You're right. Daphne, did you know Tom and I went to the same junior high? In the same little town just outside Brocksville." "No, I didn't know that," said Daphne, glancing back and forth between them. "All Tom told me was that he knew your brother." David's face was now unmistakably red. "Yeah, well, I'm different from Mitch," David insisted, looking directly at Tom. "I never said you weren't," Tom bantered back. Tom glanced at Daphne, who was taking in this encounter with very curious eyes. "Of course you're different," declared Laurel, who had just walked up beside David. She rubbed a hand up his arm and over his chest. "You're much better looking." "Yuck," Tom thought. David spouted back some sort of sweet nothings, and Tom was grateful he had to turn his attention to his cooking. This Laurel friend of Daphne's could not keep her hands off anyone, even this two-faced weasel. He couldn't deny Laurel was quite striking to look at, but the way she flaunted herself around as if she were princess of the palace made her much less attractive. "Oh well, not my business." Tom flipped the last of the fries one more time in the pan. They were now crisp and ready to serve. "Hey, Daphne, would you mind helping me with this?" Tom asked. "Sure," Daphne said readily. The two of them started placing hot fries on serving plates, dropping them quickly so as not to burn their fingers. David came up close to Daphne and whispered something in her ear, too softly for Tom to hear. "Of course," Daphne told him. Thankfully, the dreaded creep left with Laurel and headed into the living room. "I really appreciate you doing this, Tom. I know it was a lot of work, and hope you didn't feel obligated." "Not at all," Tom said as he opened the fridge to grab one more bowl of potato salad. "Is that the last of it?" Daphne inquired. "The only thing left to do is cut up the rest of the tomatoes and onions for the burgers," Tom replied. "I can help with that," Daphne offered. "Thank you," said Tom, sliding a cutting board over to her. "You're always so willing to work, Daphne." She shrugged and grabbed the knife still lying on the table. The two of them started slicing vegetables side by side in silence. Tom was glad to be next to Daphne, and he wished he could think of something to say. But, like always, whenever he wanted to talk to a girl, his tongue was stuck. "Why don't you just ask Laurel out?" Daphne asked suddenly. "What?" Tom turned to look at her in surprise and then back to his knife. "You heard me. Why don't you do it?" Tom cut a few more slices before he responded. Did Daphne suspect Tom's intentions toward her, and was now trying to divert him to Laurel? Did she really not want him that much?
I'm not interested in Laurel, Daphne,
Tom admitted. Oh, really? Asked Daphne, feigning casualness. Tom looked up at her again in confusion. Daphne stared back at him with a bit of an accusing look. You were staring at her for a full minute when she came to talk to David. I was not, Tom contradicted her. Drat, was I? Tom racked his brain back to just a minute ago. He hadn't consciously done it. Did Daphne care about that? Tom felt a spark of hope spring within him. Carefully, Tom continued to slice another tomato. Well, if I was, it's because I was thinking about what a nasty flirt she is, Tom offered truthfully. However, now he wondered if he shouldn't have spoken this way to her about her friend. Are you saying you don't like flirting, Tom? Daphne questioned, trying to sound like she was teasing. I doubt that. Tom shrugged. Not that kind of flirting. Daphne fell silent. Tom scrutinized her face, but unfortunately, it was unreadable. Hey, are you finished here? Tom looked up to see that despicable Delute again. Yes, Daphne answered. Great, said David, with an ugly, charming smile. He walked around the counter, holding out his hand to Daphne. This party is so dull without you. Daphne turned towards Delute. Tom was unable to see her face. Somehow or another, they were holding hands as Delute led them into the crowded living room. Tom clenched his teeth together again. He hated that guy. He hated him now more than ever. Hello, everyone, David called out to the crowd, holding a drink high in his hand. Most of the voices in the room died down. I would like to make a toast to our hostesses. Now all eyes were on him. Seeing this, David smiled his impossibly gorgeous smile and raised his glass. Where are you, ladies? Daphne's roommates all raised their hands. David noticed Daphne did not raise hers, so he clasped her hand in his and raised it up. To the lovely ladies of Dorm D4. Cheers rang around the room and people clapped excitedly. Almost immediately afterward, the noisy chatter resumed. David knew everyone at the party, and he dragged Daphne around with him, rarely letting go of her hand. He introduced her to them all. Most people were friendly and even giddy with the encounter. Daphne figured it was because of the novelty David was. Even the guys were jovial in their greetings and slapped him on the back. Daphne was happy to see her guests enjoying themselves, probably because they were all drinking. Daphne was disappointed Laurel had insisted on serving alcohol. She didn't want to deal with any of the aftermath in her own dorm. Besides, drunkards often exude less intelligence than a rat, and they most certainly smell like one. Oh well, there was no stopping Laurel when she wanted something. Daphne was fairly certain Laurel wanted David. Daphne was fine with this, of course, and was trying to give her plenty of opportunities to flirt with him. Much to Daphne's surprise, David kept coming back to her. Even with Laurel's supple fingers massaging his shoulders, David didn't let go of Daphne's hand. Daphne occasionally risked a peek at Tom. Each time she found him eating and conversing comfortably with those around him. He never took a single drink. One time, however, when she peeked at him, she caught him looking at her. He smiled shyly and immediately looked to the girl beside him. Making the situation even more awkward, Daphne found David staring at her when she tore her eyes away from Tom. Daphne felt her cheeks turn red. David smiled a gorgeous smile and caressed the top of her hand. You throw a great party, Daphne. Thanks. You're the life of the party, Daphne pointed out. Nah, David dismissed, batting his hand and then sipping his drink. Of course you are, Daphne persisted. Everyone loves you. David stared at Daphne's eyes directly. It was impossible to look away. His eyes were so blue, it was like being pulled right into the ocean. All right, he conceded. I'll agree to be the life of the party, if you'll agree to be the beauty of it. Daphne laughed out loud and blushed deeply. That might be going a little too far. David shook his head, still looking right at her. It's quite the understatement, actually. Daphne smiled, blushing again. Thank you. David smiled back and took another drink. Don't you hear that every day? Daphne shook her head, not knowing what to say. Well, you should, he said, beaming at her, and setting his drink down again. David rubbed his hand over Daphne's again. Their hands had been together so long they were both starting to sweat. But David didn't seem to mind. Hey, let's take a break from the crowd. What do you say? Daphne looked at him in surprise. Where would we go? Oh, just outside. I need some fresh air after being with all this bad breath in here. I can't argue with that, Daphne agreed. David looked very pleased and stood up, pulling her with him. As he led her out of the room, Daphne felt Tom's stare burning right through her back.
That evil, conniving, revolting Delute? Tom shouted in his head. I can't believe Daphne is falling for such a fake. Tom hated they were out of his sight. The way Delute had been looking Daphne up and down all night with his sleazy eyes left Tom seething in his seat. When he saw that scumbag again, he was certainly going to let him have it. Tom wasn't exactly sure how, but he was going to do it.
Chapter 22. Face Off. David led Daphne across the street from their dorm building into a small park. Daphne was starting to feel a little nervous about being alone with him, but her nerves subsided when he led her to the bench by the road. The bench was facing the sloped hill at the entrance of the park. A couple of small bushes were behind them. The fresh air was nice, and Daphne took a deep breath, taking in as much as she could. Fresh air at last, huh? David sighed, sitting beside her. In doing so, immediately he put his arm around her and pulled her close to him. Daphne was surprised David was moving so quickly, but she couldn't deny she liked it. The fact that such a gorgeous man was holding her seemed almost unbelievable. David stroked her upper arm gently with his fingers as they sat in silence and stared at the park below them. Everything looked green and inviting, so calm. It was quite the contrast from where they were only a minute ago. Daphne couldn't help but wonder what Tom was thinking. After seeing him, she had to admit an old flood of emotions came back to her. She knew if it were Tom sitting next to her, he would be a bit more shy about this, not so sure of himself. What are you thinking about? Asked David. Daphne jumped a little in her seat. David laughed lightly. You really must have been deep in thought. What's on your mind, beautiful? Daphne blushed again at his pet name. Actually, I was just thinking about how confident you are. David smiled, looking pleased. Oh, well, that's sweet of you. And what has the famous David Delute been thinking? Daphne asked. Am I famous? Absolutely. You already know that. David grinned again, his eyes shining in the pale moonlight. You're famous too, you know. Daphne laughed out loud. For what? For your good looks. Daphne chuckled some more, shaking her head. David lifted one hand up to her face, directing her sight into his. It's true, Daphne. I, for one, haven't been able to stop thinking about you all day. Really? Daphne whispered. David nodded solemnly. For the first time, he looked a little nervous. Slowly but surely, he tilted his head and pressed his lips against hers and began to move them in a soft, unfamiliar way. At first, Daphne was too shocked to move. This is too soon. But David persisted, and Daphne finally gave in and began kissing him back. Are you okay? Asked the girl beside Tom. He couldn't remember her name. He had only been half listening to their conversation because he was too distracted and abhorred at seeing David make Daphne blush. Now he couldn't stop thinking about it since they had left. He knew it was rude, but Tom found it impossible to keep his mind on her jabber about being top in her literature class, or maybe it was linguistics, he couldn't remember. All he could think about was his anticipation of seeing Daphne and the devil come back. Tom was momentarily distracted by a new game of arm wrestling at the other end of the room. Both guys were wimps. Hey! Tom felt someone elbow him in the side. It was the girl again. Are you okay? She repeated. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I've been watching the arm wrestling, said Tom, pointing to the competitive boys.
You should get in line for the next one, the girl encouraged. Tom shrugged. He knew he could beat both of them, but he didn't care. I can't believe you made these burgers, exclaimed the girl. They are seriously the best I've ever had. Tom smiled back at her. Thanks. They are my specialty. The girl sweetly started to say something else, but a booming voice from the other side of the room was so loud he couldn't hear what she said. Hey, Delute, you're back! Come join in the wrestling! Tom glanced up to see Delute and Daphne standing hand in hand by the dorm room's front door. I'm game, he called. David looked at Daphne and pulled her toward the other end of the room where the crowd of anxious contestants gathered. Wrestle me, suggested one large guy. No way, Shots. When you wrestle at school, you wrestle people who are your same weight. You're twice the size of everyone here put together. I'm not wrestling you, but maybe a fellow basketball player, said Delute as he scanned the room. I'll challenge you, Tom called loudly from his seat. All heads in the room turned to face the chef, who hadn't said much the entire evening. There you go, man, said the huge man Shots. He's about your weight. He's a perfect match. Delute's bright eyes glared at Tom. All right, he agreed. Whoever wins gets the next date with Daphne. Tom's mouth hardened. His heart raced with the challenge. Daphne can date anyone she wants, Tom declared. But I'll beat you anyway. David smirked and looked like he would have spit if they were on the court. He glanced at Daphne, who appeared completely stunned, and then back to Tom. In your dreams, Texas, David mocked in a poor impersonation of Tom's accent. Tom was happy to see Daphne elbow him in the ribs for that. That was it. Tom would not go easy on him. Daphne could not believe this. As the two men lay on the floor with their elbows on the ground and hands ready to clasp together, a few girls had come to whisper fiercely into Daphne's ear. They're fighting for you! Which one do you like better? Isn't this romantic? One girl even dared to say, I can't believe David Delute wants to date you. Daphne couldn't respond to any of them. Her eyes were glued to the two men in front of her. What would happen if David won? Poor Tom! Daphne also knew if Tom lost, he would take it much more gracefully than if David did. Everyone else in the crowded room had taken an interest in this particular challenge, since the two men had obviously displayed their distaste for each other. They were grasping hands now, and the big man Shots, who took it upon himself to be the judge, had his massive hand over theirs and began to count. 1, 2, 3. Immediately, both men pushed against the other. Both of their biceps bulged and flexed. Daphne saw David's face cringe with exertion. Tom's expression was hard, but not as stressed. Tom was a little in the lead. Abruptly, his face hardened, and a vein in his head popped out with a new rush of determination. Slowly but surely, Tom pushed David's arm backwards to the floor. There were a few cheers and automatic ohs, but most of the crowd was a bit awestruck, since they had been anticipating David's victory, and he had lost within 30 seconds. The relative silence was a bit stifling, but a few brave people broke it by saying, "Good match, good match." At this, others started to clap, repeating, "Good match, good match." Most people then busied themselves with clattering glasses and small talk. Now that it was over, Daphne realized she wasn't surprised. How many times had she seen Tom lift piles and piles of wood with ease, or heft an animal 3 times his size out of the buried snow? Maybe that hadn't been such an even match after all. Both men stood up. David's face was hard and beet red. Tom no longer looked like he wanted to punch the guts out of David, and he held out a hand to him. David refused to take it. "I always knew you weren't natural," David spit, still breathing hard. He got right in Tom's face and whispered something fierce Daphne couldn't hear. Shots put a large hand on David's shoulder. "Come on, Delute. Some guys are smashing bottles outside. Let's go." David said something else angrily in Tom's face. Tom's expression was hard, but he didn't flinch. For the first time, David left Daphne alone and escaped out the door, with Shots following closely behind. Daphne just stared at Tom, who was making an effort to act casual.
He felt her stare and gazed back at her for a long moment. Kelsey, a short, spunky, curly-haired girl, slapped him on the back. "Way to go!" Tom blinked and turned toward her, then smiled politely. "Do you lift weights or something?" she asked in a high voice. Tom shrugged. "I'm a mountain man. I lift a lot of things. Excuse me, please." Immediately, Tom took a few brisk steps to where Daphne was standing. Daphne's feet were still frozen and her eyes were still glued on Tom. "Hi," he said when he reached her side. Daphne swallowed hard. "Hi. I knew beating him would make him mad, but I did it anyway. I'm sorry." Daphne shook her head. "Oh, no, that's fine." Tom deliberated for a moment. "You don't have to tell me this if you don't want to, Daphne, but do you like him?" "Yes, Tom, I do." Tom looked down at the ground and rubbed his mouth. "Okay, Daphne," he said to the floor, but what?" Tom looked back up at her. "You should be careful, Daphne. I don't trust him." Daphne did not like this. She loved the way she had felt with David in the park a few minutes ago, and now Tom was trying to pull her another direction. It wasn't fair. "Why are you saying this, Tom? You think if you can't have me, no one else can?" Tom's face filled with surprise and a little hurt. "No, of course not, Daphne. I've always wanted you to be happy. I'm just worried about you." Now Daphne was upset. "Why, Tom? It doesn't make sense." Tom took a quick breath. He looked both careful and earnest. "He might be dangerous, Daphne." "And how is that?" Daphne was definitely challenging him now, and just realized she was raising her voice a little too much for this conversation to remain a private one. Tom placed his hands on either side of Daphne's arms. He looked her directly in the eye and spoke urgently. "I've heard him talk about you, Daphne, and it's not what a good man would say. I don't like the way he looks at you either." "How does he look at me?" Daphne whispered angrily. Tom frowned but kept his intensity. "Please, Daphne, don't make me explain it." Daphne shook Tom's arms off her. "I won't," she said coolly. "I don't need you to. I can take care of myself." "That's true, Daphne, but you can't protect yourself from every kind of creep all the time." Daphne felt like yelling at Tom, but fortunately she didn't. "David is not a creep," she said in a low voice. "I don't need you to protect me from him, nor do I want you to talk to me about it anymore." Tom's eyes rolled in frustration. "If you would just listen to me, Daphne, you would be reasonable like I know you can be. Don't fall for his tricks." "Oh, and you didn't play tricks, Tom? You always led me on," she accused, jabbing a finger at his chest. Tom's calm was beginning to crack. "I was never deceitful in any way," he contradicted with bitterness. Then he sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, Daphne, I'm sorry," he said, scratching his head. "I better go. Thanks for the party." The adrenaline pounding inside Daphne prevented her from doing much of anything for the remainder of the night. She couldn't sit still, nor could she be productive. She couldn't go home since she was already home. She wished she could just run into her room and hide, but there was a couple making out in there. Oh, how could she have been so rude to Tom? She had accused him again of being deceitful when she knew very well he never had been. She said it to be hurtful because she was angry. She had intentionally been hurtful to Tom, the sweetest man alive. Daphne slumped in her chair, feeling more ashamed than ever. And now Tom was gone, again, and so was David. To Daphne's surprise, Laurel didn't even come to her rescue and save her from her awful feelings. Daphne scanned the room for her friend. There she was, playing ping-pong with a guy Daphne didn't know. Several other people were surrounding their game and cheering Laurel on. Laurel did seem to have taken an interest in David. I wonder what she will say when I tell her he kissed me tonight. Out of the blue, Daphne felt an elbow brush across her knee. David was kneeling in front of her chair with a drink in his hand. "Hey there, beautiful." His speech was slurred, followed by giggles and hiccups. "David, are you drunk?" asked Daphne, a bit disgusted. "Of course not," lied David, hiccuping again. "I do want to ask you a Why, David, I've never seen you so Free, said a new voice beside them. Daphne turned her head to see Laurel sitting next to her. David smiled and pointed a raised finger at Laurel. You are smoking hot, he said sluggishly. Daphne groaned to herself, but Laurel put a hand to her chest and feigned flattery. Oh, David, just listen to you. David smiled stupidly again and now pointed to Daphne. But Daphne here is... He paused to lick his lips. Daphne is a mighty fine too, and she's a good girl, you know what I mean? David slapped his thigh and laughed grotesquely. This time both Daphne and Laurel just stared at him. David lifted his chin some more as if he'd just thought of a great idea. I have a question for you, Daphne, he said. Will you... He paused as he let out a high laugh. He swallowed again. Will you marry me, Daphne? Daphne felt her jaw drop, as several others around them gasped, gaped, and giggled. No way am I going to talk to you until you're serious, David. David raised his finger and pointed at her again. Oh, I'm serious, he said, very slowly and with some difficulty. Ugh, Daphne muttered under her breath. I'm going to bed, she said to Laurel. I'll help you clean up in the morning. Laurel nodded as Daphne quickly stood up to leave. Wait, baby! Don't leave! David called to her. Daphne shook her head and pushed open the door leading to the hallway and left the room. And that concludes Chapter 22. I hope you join me next time for Chapter 23, which is called Skin Deep. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.